She was never supposed to end up there. A small-town girl from Gonzales, Texas, born into a house where love was complicated and safety was never guaranteed, Hall was the last person anyone would have predicted to grace the covers of Vogue, to walk the runways of Paris, or to become the most talked-about woman in the orbit of the world's most dangerous rock star. But life has a way of rewriting the stories we think we know, and at 70 years old, Hall has finally decided to tell hers on her own terms. What she has revealed is not the glamorous fairy tale that the tabloids sold for decades. It is something far more raw, far more painful, and far more human than any headline ever captured. The real story of her 22-year entanglement with Mick Jagger is one of passion twisted into possession, of promises made in candlelight and broken in broad daylight, of a woman who gave everything to a man who was constitutionally incapable of giving anything back. And the most devastating part is not the betrayal itself. It is how long she believed it would stop. Faye Hall was born on July 2, 1956, into a world that offered her very little. Her father, John Hall, was a long-haul truck driver who had returned from World War II carrying wounds that no one could see and demons that everyone in the household could feel. Her mother, Marjorie Nell, worked as a medical records librarian, holding the family together with a quiet, fierce determination that would later be recognized as the blueprint for her own survival. There were 5 daughters in that house, and among them, she shared the closest bond with her identical twin sister Terry, a connection so deep that it would become her anchor through the darkest seasons of her life. The family eventually settled in Mesquite, a working-class suburb where money was always tight and tension was always present. Jagger's father struggled with severe anger issues rooted in post-traumatic stress, and the household existed in a permanent state of hypervigilance. The girls learned to read the atmosphere the moment they walked through the door, to anticipate the next outburst, and to disappear before the storm arrived. It was not a childhood. It was a survival course. And yet, inside that chaos, something extraordinary was developing quietly. Hall possessed a verified IQ of 146, a mind so sharp and restless that the confines of her small Texas life could barely contain it. She devoured books, excelled in every classroom she entered, and graduated from North Mesquite High School at just 16 years old, simultaneously completing college-level coursework that most adults would have found overwhelming. The classroom was her refuge, the one place where the chaos of her home life could not follow her, where her intelligence was not a burden but a weapon, a tool she was quietly sharpening for a world she had not yet seen but could already feel pulling at her from somewhere beyond the flat Texas horizon. And then, as if the universe had decided she had waited long enough, the door opened. It came in the form of an insurance settlement, modest by any measure, just $800 following a car accident injury, but in Hall's hands, that check was not compensation. It was a one-way ticket out. In 1973, at 17 years old, she walked onto a plane bound for Paris, France, with a single suitcase, no connections, no plan, and no intention of ever returning to the life she was leaving behind. The decision was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most reckless, and in the years that followed, it would prove to be both. She arrived in the city of light the way most dreamers do, wide-eyed and completely unprepared for how indifferent a great city can be to a young woman with nothing but ambition and a face that stopped traffic. But Hall was not ordinary, and Paris, to its credit, recognized that quickly. She was sunbathing on a beach in Saint-Tropez when fashion agent Claude Haddad spotted her, a chance encounter that would detonate like a quiet bomb inside the trajectory of her entire life. Within weeks, she was walking runways, appearing in magazines, and building a career that moved at a speed that felt less like progress and more like flight. She found an apartment in Paris and, in one of those strange coincidences that only seem to happen to people who are destined for extraordinary lives, her roommates turned out to be a then unknown Grace Jones and a quietly determined Jessica Lange. 3 young women from completely different corners of the world, thrown together in a small Parisian apartment, navigating an industry that was glamorous on the surface and ruthless underneath. They supported each other, celebrated each other, and pushed each other forward through every rejection and every breakthrough. Became a muse for the legendary photographer Helmut Newton, whose powerful, provocative imagery showcased her 6-foot frame and golden hair in ways that redefined the aesthetic standard of the mid-1970s. By 1977, less than 4 years after leaving Texas with $800 and a dream, she had secured over 40 major international magazine covers and was earning more than $1,000 a day. The girl from Mesquite had not just arrived. She had conquered. But conquest, as Hall was about to discover, has a way of attracting predators dressed as princes. The summer of 1975 brought with it a collaboration that would reshape her personal life as dramatically as Claude Haddad's discovery had reshaped her professional one. Brian Jagger, the sophisticated and magnetic frontman of the pioneering art rock band Roxy Music, was searching for a striking figure to grace the cover of the band's fifth studio album, Siren. He had seen Jagger's portfolio and requested her specifically, drawn to her statuesque beauty and her ability to embody the kind of otherworldly glamour that his music was built around. The shoot took place on a rocky shore in Anglesey, Wales, under conditions that were as uncomfortable as they were surreal. Was painted completely blue from head to toe and fitted into a tight rubber mermaid suit that made walking impossible. The paint was cold, the wind was relentless, and the shoot was grueling, but she was a professional, and she delivered exactly what Jagger had envisioned. As a gesture of courtesy toward the difficult conditions, Jagger invited her back to his London apartment to wash off the body paint. What was meant to be a practical arrangement became something neither of them had planned for. They talked for hours, discovering a shared passion for art, music, and ideas, and by the time the blue paint had washed away, something else entirely had taken its place. A relationship that moved fast, burned bright, and carried within it, from the very beginning, the seeds of its own destruction. Jagger was 30 years old, cultured, established, and operating at the peak of his creative powers. Jagger was 19, rising, and intoxicated by his worldliness and artistic vision. Just 5 months after their first meeting, Jagger proposed, and she accepted. The press celebrated them as the golden couple of rock and fashion, and for a moment, the image held. But behind the carefully curated public appearances and the magazine spreads lay a relationship corroding under the weight of Jagger's possessiveness. He struggled with her independence, with her growing fame, with the reality that the woman he wanted to keep as his private muse was becoming a global icon in her own right. The arguments intensified. The control tightened. And Hall, who had spent her entire childhood learning to survive inside a household ruled by an unpredictable and domineering man, began to recognize the pattern she was trapped inside. Then came the summer of 1976, and with it, a dinner party in London that would change everything. Mick Jagger, the most electrifying and notorious rock star on the planet, invited Jagger and his fiancée to his table. It was meant to be a social evening among acquaintances. It became the beginning of the end of everything she had built and the start of something that would consume the next 22 years of her life. Jagger had orchestrated the seating arrangement with the precision of a man who always got what he wanted and had never once been told otherwise. He positioned himself directly beside Jagger, and from the moment the evening began, his attention was singular and unmistakable. She later recalled in her memoirs that he pressed his knee against hers beneath the table, and that the contact sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was immediate and overwhelming, a magnetic pull that bypassed every rational thought she possessed and went straight to something deeper and more dangerous. Jagger sat across the table, completely unaware that the ground beneath his engagement was quietly giving way. The affair began in secret and moved through the shadows of late 1976 and into 1977 with the kind of intensity that only forbidden things can sustain. To avoid the ever-present paparazzi, they met in locations that felt deliberately chosen for their anonymity and their romance. Underground jazz clubs in Harlem. Hot dog stands on Coney Island. Low-profile bars in the backstreets of Tokyo. Jagger would physically cover his prominent mouth with his hands in public spaces to avoid recognition, a gesture that was equal parts comical and telling, the most famous lips in rock and roll hidden behind cupped palms on a street corner, all for stolen moments with a woman who was engaged to someone else. Later admitted that the secrecy added an intoxicating layer to everything, that every stolen hour felt precious precisely because it was dangerous. But beneath the excitement, a more complicated truth was forming. She was not simply falling in love. She was falling into a pattern she did not yet have the language to recognize. In 1977, she broke off her engagement to Jagger and committed fully to Jagger, who subsequently separated from his wife Bianca, finalizing their divorce in 1979. The world watched with fascination and judgment in equal measure. But believed, with the conviction of a woman who had fought for everything she had ever wanted, that this was different. That he was different. That love, real love, the kind she had never been given as a child, was finally within reach. She was wrong. Almost immediately, the cracks appeared. She delivered an ultimatum early in the relationship, forcing Jagger to abandon his heavy substance use, and to his credit, he complied. His willpower was genuine, his discipline impressive, and for a brief window, it felt like proof that he was capable of change. But soon discovered that he had simply exchanged one compulsion for another. The substances disappeared. The infidelities took their place. And the cycle that would define the next 2 decades of her life began its first quiet, devastating rotation. She stayed because she loved him, and because love, when it is the only stable thing you have ever fought for, becomes almost impossible to release even when it is destroying you. Hall had grown up in a household where affection was rationed and safety was conditional, and somewhere in the architecture of her childhood, she had learned to equate turbulence with normalcy and forgiveness with strength. Jagger's infidelities were not occasional lapses. They were a consistent, almost methodical pattern that ran beneath the surface of their life together like a current she could feel but could never quite locate. She built a family inside that current, bringing 4 children into a relationship that was simultaneously her greatest source of joy and her most enduring source of pain. Elizabeth Scarlett arrived in 1984, James Leroy in 1985, Georgia May in 1992, and Gabriel Luke in 1997, each child a declaration of hope, each birth a moment when allowed herself to believe that the weight of parenthood would finally anchor a man who had never allowed himself to be anchored by anything. It never did. The most public and devastating fracture came in 1992, within 24 hours of Georgia May's birth. While lay recovering in a French hospital, Jagger boarded a flight to Thailand for a secret holiday with model Carla Bruni. The betrayal was not just personal. It was theatrical in its cruelty, timed with a precision that suggested either complete indifference or something even darker. When discovered the truth through intercepted messages, she announced a separation. But Jagger returned with charm and promises, and she took him back, because she always took him back, because the alternative was admitting that the 22 years she had invested in this man had been built on a foundation that was never solid. By 1995, exhausted by denial she could no longer believe, she hired a private detective to track his movements through London's nightclub scene. The detective delivered exactly what she already knew but needed confirmed on paper. She had leverage now. She had proof. But then came the pregnancy with Gabriel in 1996, and with it, one final attempt to save something that had been broken for years. The Balinese wedding ceremony of November 1990 had already proven to be a cruel illusion. The elaborate 6-hour Hindu ritual in Bali, Indonesia, the traditional garments, the sacred vows exchanged before family and friends, the moment had allowed herself to believe she was finally, legally, permanently his wife, had been rendered void by the UK High Court in July 1999. The court determined that the ceremony had never been registered with Indonesian authorities and that the proper civil licenses had never been filed. With a single ruling, 22 years of devotion were legally erased. Instead of a divorce settlement, she received a multi-million-dollar out-of-court payment and the cold official designation of unmarried partner. But at 70, speaking with a clarity and self-possession that 2 decades of heartbreak had forged rather than diminished, Hall says she carries no active resentment. She hosts Sunday lunches at her home where Jagger arrives with his current partner and their young son, and she describes the arrangement as odd but fully operational. What she does carry is something more valuable than bitterness. She carries the hard-won knowledge of her own worth, the understanding that the patterns she tolerated were learned long before Mick Jagger ever pressed his knee against hers at a dinner table in London. And that knowledge, arriving at 70 with the quiet force of something that was always true but took a lifetime to finally say out loud, is perhaps the most powerful thing she has ever owned.